What's up guys, welcome to our tutorial for the month of September. In this one, we're going to be talking about lighting. This is going to be another introductory tutorial to this topic. We're going to go through some of the basic theories of light so that you guys know what to look for when you start rendering one of your drawings. And we're also going to do some quick demonstrations at the end. So with that being said, let's jump right in. I'm going to be using some of our illustrations from my art book for the examples in this video. And hopefully with these explanations in video form, you guys can get a really good understanding and grasp of light. Now, the first theory of light that you got to understand when you're trying to render light is that light always travels in a straight line. So what this example is showing you guys is effectively that wherever a light source is, you can trace the light rays back to that light source and get an understanding of where the shadows should be placed. In this example in the bottom right, the light would be coming from straight down. Now there are a couple things to pay attention to on the sphere as well as on the surface. So let's just say, for example, that you're using these spheres as a reference and you're trying to render them. The first thing you want to look for is direction of light. In this case, we found the direction of light. The other thing that we got to look for are the types of shadows that you see, right? So here on this sphere, what you're going to find is that there is a light surface here. This is where most of the light is going to reach. There's a transitional area here. This area just below is going to be in shadow. Now there's two different types of shadows that are being exhibited by these spheres. Number one, very important, is form shadow. Okay, so this basically refers to, if you can see the light on my face right now, the shadows that you might see on the ridge of my nose, maybe on the ridge of my neck. You know, these are areas that are not being hit directly by the light, so they are in shadow. And it's a type of shadow that occurs on the form of the object, hence the term form shadow. Okay, very simple. Now the other type of shadow that you want to pay attention to is cast shadow. Okay, it's exactly as the name sounds. So remembering that light travels in a straight line, when there's an object like this sphere here blocking the path of the light rays, that light is not going to reach this area just underneath the sphere. So that's going to be called a cast shadow because there's something blocking light from reaching that surface. Now the lighting here is not super strong, but I can give you an example. Okay, so you look at my nose, there's a form shadow on my nose. Now my nose is going to cast a shadow if I allow it to. So if I put my hand just behind, you can see just behind my face. Well, now this section of my face is casting a shadow onto my hand. See this dark part right there? That's a cast shadow. And both of these types of shadows that you're going to see occur because light travels in a straight line. Always remember that. And just to get over some more basics for you guys, okay, on this sphere, on this form that you see here, there's a light surface and there's a shadow surface, right? And within both of these surfaces, you're going to see variations in terms of the value. So some parts are darker, some parts are lighter. The light is not one completely uniform tone, and neither is the shadow, nor is the cast shadow, okay? The reason for this is light doesn't just travel to an object and stop. So when you're observing a reference, when you're looking for that light source, remember that light rays sometimes will hit a surface, especially if it's a very strong light source. It might hit that surface and then bounce back onto other objects in the environment. So this sphere being placed on a white surface is going to catch a lot of the bounce light that's going to hit this surface and then bounce back up onto the shadowy side of this sphere. It's going to be a weaker light because it's bouncing, so it's not going to be nearly as strong as the light surface, but you're still going to be able to see a variation in terms of the values. So because of this variation, right, because this area is going to be lighter due to the bounce light, this area, this strip right here, is going to be the darkest because it's the area where light reaches the least. So that's going to be called the core shadow. You're going to see this on a lot of things, right? Sometimes on portraits, you'll see it on the ridge of a person's nose, and on any kind of cylindrical object, like a person's arm or leg, you might see a core shadow and bounce light, okay? Just look out for these things. Now, in this case, I've also included a fade in the cast shadow, right? It gets lighter as we get to the edge, and that's because I'm assuming there's gonna be ambient light and bounce light in the environment. Ambient light just refers to, you know, for example, if you have the sun in the sky, that's going to be your primary light source. That's going to be the main light source casting light onto your subjects. But the blue color of the sky is also going to be casting a blue light onto your subject. So that's going to be called the ambient light. That's the light that's just present in the environment at that moment. Another good example would be if your character's, let's say, standing under a street light. So that street light's going to be the main source of light. But let's say there were some neon signs at one of the stores nearby. You might get an ambient light of green or red in this environment. So just something to keep in mind here. I know it's a lot and we're going through this really fast, but these are just some of the basics, okay? You gotta know this stuff if you're trying to render light. Now I wanna showcase how I personally like to think about lighting in the reference photos that I use, and also the steps that I take in terms of building up the light and the variation of colors on my subjects. So when I look at a reference, for example, like this one here, the first thing I'm gonna look for is where the main light source is, right? And the main light source, we can assume it's the sun because she's standing outside, you can see the blue sky, and it's coming from this direction. How do you know this? Well, because the shadows on this side of the nose, right? The shadows on this side of the forehead, and because light travels in a straight line, the light couldn't be here and curve around like that. It's just physically not possible. So we know that the sun's gonna be at this angle. Once you've identified that light source, it becomes a lot easier, right? You can kind of outline these shapes for where the shadow is going to be, right? Where the planes of the face are going to transition to the other side, and these areas are going to be in shadow. So you can kind of see here that the portion that I've outlined is going to be the area that light, the primary light source, is not going to reach. This is the first thing that I look for when I'm trying to render any kind of subject. Could be a person, could be an object. And now just for the sake of a demonstration, I'm going to just fill in these shapes. All right, and then I'm going to turn off the original reference layer. If you squint your eyes, take a little step back, it does kind of look like half of a face, right? A face cast in shadow. And this is the power of simplifying your lights and your shadows. I talked a little bit about this in our last rendering tutorial as well, breaking things down. Start with one thing at a time, okay? So the first thing we're starting with is primary light source, right? Breaking the subject into light and shadow. Even if the light source is relatively weak, you can still do this and soften them up later on. And I'll give you guys some examples of that. Now you can see that even if I turn off the sketch layer, there's no more information in terms of lines, you can still determine that this is a face, right? Simply because of the shapes of these form and cast shadows. Now, once you have this, you're also going to start noticing that in the shadowy areas of the character's face, you don't necessarily get the same color all throughout the shadow section of the face. That's because the shadow side of the face is being affected by ambient light and bounce light in the environment, okay? And these are going to be terms that you're going to be hearing all throughout your entire art journey. So get used to them. Usually in my process, I don't have a strict order on which light source I start tackling next. So once you find that direct light source, you can jump into ambient light or bounce light. Now in this video, I'm just going to explain ambient light first, okay? And you probably already have a sense of what this means. In this example painting here, you can see that the sky is quite blue, right? And the blue sky is going to be casting an ambient light on the shadow side of the character's face. See, the light side of the character's face is essentially bathed in sunlight. And because sunlight is such a strong light source, it outcompetes the ambient light in the environment. So the blue light is not going to show up on the surface that the sunlight is hitting, but it will show up in the shadows because there is a lack of a strong light source in that area. So in this case, if I take my eyedropper tool, you can see that the light side of the face looks like regular skin tone, but if I shift it over to the shadow side, well, now we're getting blue, right? We're getting blue colors on skin. And it's a bit counterintuitive because you think of skin as a warm, beige, orangey kind of warm color. So how could there be blue on there? Well, the explanation is always look for other light sources in the environment that might be affecting the color of the shadow. And in some of these areas, you might see a reddish bluish color, and that's just because when you project blue light onto a surface that's warm like the skin, you might get something leaning a little bit more towards the purples. Whenever you render an object, always remember that the surface of the object has a certain color and the light casting onto it also has a certain color. Okay? That's something to keep in mind. Now, I want you to take a moment and look at our previous reference image, okay? And look for the color of the shadow. So you see in some of these areas, like on the side of the nose, on the side of the temple, there's a clear shift towards blues, especially when you compare it to the other areas around it that might be a little bit warmer, right? So if I'm rendering this character, once I found the primary direct light source, I'll use a brush that allows me to glaze a really thin layer onto whatever colors I put down. So for example, here, I can glaze a blue over the forehead area like that, right? And if I'm rendering this character, I just put a little bit of blue right there, a little bit of blue right there where I see the blue. And you can see that soft glaze allows that ambient light to really blend into the color that's already underneath it. And the ambient light really gives your shadows a lot more dimension. It gives your shadows a lot more visual interest. So never ever discount the ambient light, no matter how subtle it might be. Oftentimes in my work, I like to kind of exaggerate the ambient light, like the light that you see here. The original reference was not blue, but I made it blue and somehow it's still Makes sense. Now the next subject that I want to cover, and we're almost done with the talking guys, don't worry, is bounce light. Okay, bounce light is so important in making your subject look believable. In our world, in the world that you see with your eyes, light is always bouncing off of all kinds of surfaces, and they might project back up and reach other surfaces. So this is one of the examples that I really like that I put in my art book here. If you put a red sheet of paper right here, right, against the direction where the light is coming from, say light's gonna come in this direction, right, and some of it is going to bounce back up. Now, the light doesn't just bounce back up as the original color. It's going to carry some of this red with it. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if I turn on the bounce light layer, you're going to see it's going to look something like this. So the surface here on the face that's very close to the sheet of paper is going to get cast in a nice warm red light. And you're going to see this a lot with people and skin and sunlight. You know, for example, if someone's standing, they're getting a light source hitting them here. Actually, you can probably see it on my face here. If I put my hand just next to my face, look at this part, right? It gets a little bit warmer. You see a little bit of light there. That's bounce light. Now, if you don't pay attention to that and you remove that from your rendering, you're actually removing a very subtle layer of believability. So you can see in this example here too, we're getting a direct light source casting this very bright white rim on the character. But because of that bright direct light, you're also going to get a lot of bounce light, right? You can assume that the sun is entering the room. Some of it is bouncing back up off of the skin. Some of it is bouncing back up off of the floor. And especially this area here, the bright shoulder, is going to project a lot of light back onto the underside of the chin. So on these examples, you can kind of see the various types of light in practice, right? Just down here, you're getting a direct light source. This is going to be the sunlight, right? Because that's a very strong light source. A lot of it is going to bounce back up. So on the underside of the chin, underside of the lips, you're going to get a bright orange kind of color, right? On the underside of the brows as well. Now in this piece right here, you can also see that there is a cast of red on the hair, on the face of the character. If you're wondering why is there red on the skin of the character, look for the light sources in the environment. There could be a neon sign, and it's casting a very thin wash of colors onto that subject. Now there's one thing here that we haven't talked about yet, and that is rim light. Rim light is very simple. It's basically any kind of light source that's coming from behind the subject. So for example, here you're seeing me from this angle. Now, if there was a light just behind me over there, you're gonna be able to see a bright white rim on the side of my silhouette. Rim light is really effective for bringing out the silhouette of your character. The way I like to think of it is a primary light source, okay? It's shining really brightly onto your subject, but you're just not seeing the side that it's lighting up. So here's your subject, light's coming from this way. If you view this subject behind the light source, you're gonna see a rim light. And I'll just show you guys that in the demo as well. So I've got a couple of examples here, and first I wanna run through some of these theoretical elements to see if we can spot them in an actual reference. So I'm gonna draw this character. What's the first thing I'm gonna look for? I'm gonna try to find that primary direct light source. In this case, I know it's gonna be coming from this side. Again, the reason being that light only travels in a straight line, and this half of the nose is in shadow while this half is in light. So that means the light's coming from that direction. And we can assume that it's a pretty warm light source. You know, the character's skin's getting a really yellow cast on it. There's a lot of very saturated oranges and reds. It almost looks like a sunset, but I think it's some kind of artificial lamp. So that's the first thing I want us to identify. And it also helps to understand why these shadows are occurring. So for example, this ridge on the nose is going to be a form shadow because the form of the nose doesn't allow light to reach the other side. But you see this hard edge right here, just under the eye, that's actually going to be a cast shadow. Now, why is that a cast shadow? Well, because the ridge of the nose is blocking light from hitting this surface. If he had no nose, his entire face would be in light. But this nose blocks that part of the face. And as you get down to the lips, you can see these areas are all different types of form shadow. Okay, the shadow follows the form of the face and the shadow depicts. And as you move down the mouth to the chin, you can see these are all areas of form shadow. These shadows follow the form of the face and they also inform you of the form of the face. Now, if we move our way down to the shadow on the neck here, for example, this is another form shadow, but here you're getting a cast shadow because it doesn't make sense for this to be a form shadow, right? Because this whole surface is facing the light. So the only explanation for a shadow being here is that something is blocking the light. And if you trace the light's path back, you can see it's the chin and the face. Same thing with the shadow right here on this side of the body, right? Again, this body's facing the light, but this jacket is casting a shadow onto the body, so you don't see these parts in light. It's good to identify these things, and it's good to be able to know the difference between cast and form shadows, because not all shadows are made equal and they shouldn't all be treated equal. So once we know this, we can start to apply a base color, okay? And if you followed our last rendering tutorial, you probably already have a grasp of this, but essentially we're putting down a color that we think best represents a certain portion of our subject. And in this case, we're putting down the color that we see in the light section, okay? In the section that's being affected by light. It's gonna be this really warm yellowish color. And once I've done this, the next thing that I'm going to do is apply the color for the shadow, okay? This is the shadow that's being caused by the primary light source. So I'm going to just start up a new layer, create a clipping mask, and the shadow to my eyes looks a little bit reddish, pinkish, purplish. Now just to pause real quick, there's one thing that a lot of people do that I think is a huge mistake, okay? There's a lot of tutorials out there that I see that are like, okay, now just make a multiply layer and set it to a purplish color, you know, maybe like this, and just brush it onto the face. Now in this case, this might actually work. And you might be like, wow, it's so simple, it's so effective. But the problem is, the color of the shadows are always changing, okay? It completely depends on the environment that your character is in. In this case, a purplish shadow works because you're getting a really warm color all throughout this environment, right? You're getting a cast of pink and purple and reds. But what if he was standing in a room that was green? Then that purple color is not gonna work, okay? So you gotta be flexible. Don't just use a single color for all of your shadows. Actually observe the color that you see in it and ask yourself why. So I'm going to turn this back to a normal layer. Okay, I'm just going to pick the color that I think best represents the shadow. Now obviously there's a lot of transitions in the shadow, so we're not going to be able to pin down all the colors, but I'm just going to try to get as close as I can. I think this is pretty good, maybe a little bit darker. Now what we're doing here is called color blocking, and we're essentially not paying attention to any of the details. We're only working with big blocks of colors. Okay, we're gonna start off really simple and then work our way down to small details. You definitely wanna get this stage right. It's very critical to get this stage right before jumping into too many details. So here, I'm gonna just work my way down to this cast shadow on the traps, following the form shadow here on the neck, just like so, and then we're gonna erase away some of these extra brush strokes. Now another thing is, this doesn't have to be perfect, okay? You can kind of just follow the general idea of the shape of the shadow, but you don't need to start worrying about, you know, blending these surfaces. We'll worry about that a little bit later on. Because right now, what we're trying to do is, we're just trying to establish the right placement for these shadows. See, I'm trying to find the areas that are going to be in shadow on the eyelid here, on the eyebrows, for example. At this point, placement matters more than anything else. I'm going to erase away some of these parts here because the eye is partially in light. And if you've followed along with me and you've got to this stage so far, we are off to a very good start. The next thing, like I said before, that I like to look for are other light sources that could be potentially affecting the shadows, okay? In this case, I see quite a bit of bounce light. So here on this outer edge of the face, you can see the color is really a lot brighter than some of these other shadowy areas. And again, I want you to ask yourself why. Why is that? Now to my eyes, it looks as though the light is hitting this surface on the skin and some of it is bouncing back up and reaching the shadow side of the face. So that part's naturally going to be a little bit brighter. It's going to be a little bit warmer. You're going to notice that bounce light coming back from the skin kind of has a really rich and saturated orange tone. So I'm going to take a warm orange color here and I'm going to take a brush that has some pressure opacity and we're going to glaze this color on top, just like that, along the plane that's being hit by the bounce light. And just down here at the chin, it's actually quite strong. You can assume that this bounce light is brighter down here because it's being affected by more light here on the chest. So just like that, you know, clean up the edges a little bit. But that's not the only surface where I'm seeing a little bit of bounce light. I'm also seeing a little bit here on this side of the nose, okay? And this is very common. If there's bounce light coming from the other direction, this plane of the nose tends to catch a lot of it. There might also be a little bit just up here below the brow ridge because that's also a plane that's kind of facing downwards. Maybe a little bit here inside the brow ridge as well. So now we've placed down our bounce light. But if you pay a little bit of attention to here to the neck, I do think there's also a little bit of bounce light here and right here. So now that that's looking good, okay, Depending on your rendering style, you can choose to blend these edges out. You can soften this up. It gives it a more realistic feel, but if you don't soften it up, it makes your character look more graphic and more stylized. Okay, just depends on personal preference, but I'm gonna just soften these up as an example here. So that's pretty good, right? We've got the light, the primary light source, we've got the shadow, the color of the shadow, and we've got a secondary color in the shadow now being caused by the bounce light. Now we're gonna add on top another layer. And there's another type of light that's present here. I'm sure you guys have already seen it. It's this bluish tone here on the front plane of the face that's in the shadow. So you can probably assume that there's some type of cool light source just in front of this character. And we're gonna take a blue color, again, using the same technique. Okay, I start a new layer. I'm gonna add this blue using the same glazing kind of method. Just very thin layer, allow it to blend in with the colors underneath. It got a little bit too thick here, but no worries, we're just gonna kind of cut back into it. And there's some of this light I see on the forehead as well, a little bit on the side of the chin here, side of the mouth. Again, I'm gonna now take my blending brush and just blend it out. Okay, allow it to really fade into the other parts of the character's skin. And here in the space between the nose and the eye, you see that the light is a little bit stronger. So I'm gonna just accentuate that right there. And just like that. Now let's move down, add some of this blue ambient light here onto the shoulders. Again, very, very soft, okay? Be very light-handed with this. You don't want to overpower the colors that are already there. Just like that. Now, blend it out. See, all of a sudden now you've accomplished basically 3 colors in the shadows and 1 color in the light. Now we can start adding another layer into the light, because usually, you know, skin, clothes, whatever object you're drawing, there's going to be areas that catch the light a little bit better. It's usually because the plane there is facing that light source really directly, and it's really bouncing light back into your eye. So you see it as a brighter surface. Now here you can see on the cheeks and on the side of the nose here, there's definitely a brighter surface that is visible. Okay, so we're gonna just, same technique, place these light areas here. There's a little bit on the upper side of the mouth and a little bit on the chin as well. And there we go, a little bit of highlight on the side of the nose, maybe a bit more on the chin there. And you can see that the character's face in the light area is starting to take on more dimensionality. Right? You can add the same kind of light here towards the collarbone area, just like so. And again, you can choose to blend this out or leave it as is if you want a more graphic rendering style. I'm gonna just blend it a little bit, and I think that looks pretty good. So here at this point, we've basically captured all the various different types of lighting in this scenario. Now, you have the freedom to start adding some more depth. You know, you can choose to do this with regular blend mode, or you can choose to do this with the multiply layer. But I'll just choose some of the colors that are similar to what's already there. We can just add some darkness, some contrast to some of these areas, right? Like for example, the lips, you can add a darker shadow here to the ambient occlusion. And for those who don't know, ambient occlusion refers to an area that just doesn't receive any light. So maybe the crease of the mouth, maybe the crease in the ear, like so. You can start to really add a lot of depth, right? And there's some darkness here just on the inside of the brow ridge, a little bit of that darkness just under the hair as well. You can blend it out, soften these edges. I'm gonna move downwards here, and you do see a bit of ambient occlusion, some much darker contrasty places here just underneath the hair on the shoulder here, and you can add that in. So this is kind of just adding a hint of contrast, kind of a final punch to the color of the shadows. Okay, so this is before, this is after, before, after, before, after. And that really gets your character's three-dimensional form to pop. Last but not least, you might also want to add some highlights just to show the kind of glistening nature of the skin. Now, highlights are usually small little bright spots that you might see on the tip of the nose. You might see them on the cheeks. You might see a little bit of them on the lips there, maybe a little bit on the inside of the eye. But it really gives your skin a little bit more texture. And highlights can occur on any object that's a little bit shinier on its surface. If you have a completely matte object, you're not gonna get highlights. But if you want that object to look a little bit shiny, apply a highlight and immediately it changes the texture of that subject. Textures is not our main focus in this video, but it kind of does play into lighting, and we'll probably talk about textures in a future tutorial. So if you followed along, you know, there you go. There's a simple rendition of light for your character. Now, obviously here, you know, you can add even more. You can use a soft airbrush, some warm colors, and add to the pop of color that you might see on the nose, the colors you might see on the cheeks, maybe, you know, red on the lips like that. completely up to you. You know, you can stylize your character however you want, but you got the lighting down now. So now here in this second example that we've got, I want to show you guys a little bit less of a typical kind of lighting scenario. This one's going to be a bit strange. So we're going to follow the same steps, right? We're going to just put down the color for the skin. That's going to be our main color. This is going to be the color of the skin in light. And we'll worry about the shadows in just a second. All right, so now you've got the skin tone, but how do we do the shadows here? Because the shadows are so soft, you almost don't see any edges. You don't see any really harsh transitions here. In this scenario, I like to kind of just the shadow color, okay? And I would go in regardless with a hard edge brush, okay? I would try to avoid using too much of the airbrush because you can become overly reliant on this thing. Now I'm gonna start a new layer, clipping mask, and using just a regular round brush here that everybody has access to, I'm gonna apply the shadow to the areas that I see it, okay? So in this case, you know, I'm seeing a little bit here on the eye area, just like that. I'm seeing a little bit of it on the very tip of the nose, on the bottom side of the nose, a little bit on the front side of the mouth. There's a bit of shadow on the front plane of the face here. Most of the lips are going to be in shadow as well. And there's also going to be shadow just beneath the jawline, okay? And I'm also still using kind of a glazing technique here because this shadow is going to be a lot softer. So once you've done this step, I want you to ask yourself, does it look right? You know, does the shadow placement look correct? Is there kind of a discernible form to the subject that we're drawing? Now, I would argue that this is probably more difficult than a very contrasty lighting scenario because the things that you got to work with are a lot more subtle. So in this case, I think it does work. We're getting this very weak kind of main light source here hitting the subject, and I'm just going to use my blending brush and soften these edges up. Now the reason that I went in with a hard edge first is because just in case there's some hard edges that I want to preserve, I have the option to do that. Whereas with an airbrush, you're kind of just making only soft edges. So, you know, I do see some hard edges here just on the side of the nose, but definitely a soft edge on the front ridge there. Okay, and once you've softened it up, you can see it's taking on a lot more three-dimensionality. Now the skin color on this character looks kind of dead, so I'm just going to apply a very soft wash with my airbrush of a warmer kind of skin tone color. And you can kind of see that here in the neck area. And there we go. Now it looks a bit better with the wash. So one of the most prominent things with a reference like this is that you're going to notice that the strongest light source is not actually the light source that's lighting up the character that's facing us. The strongest light source is actually coming from behind the character. So if you were viewing this character on the other side, you would see a very contrasty, very saturated kind of rendition of this character. Whereas on this side, we're kind of looking at the character from the perspective of the shadow, and we're only seeing the colors based on the strength of the ambient light. So I always like to say a shadow is not a complete absence of light. Whatever you see in this shadow here is being cast by the color of the ambient light. Now, I'm seeing a lot of cool tones here. There's a lot of kind of tealish, bluish tones on the surfaces like the nose here that's facing us. So we're gonna go with a slightly grayish teal color. In lighting scenarios like this one, you gotta be really careful not to overdo the contrast, right? Because we really are looking at this character from a very, very, very weak light source. So the transitions here are gonna be very subtle, right? So you see I've glazed on a soft kind of bluish, tealish color onto this surface here, just by the temple, and it's a very soft transition. Now, you can also notice that there's some areas here that are a little bit more pinkish, a little bit more rosy. Again, using a soft airbrush here, I'm just gonna glaze that in very gently. There's a little bit more of this red on the ear. Again, just softly glaze that in. Now I'm gonna take this bright highlight color, bring it down to the neck. You can see a ridge of highlight on the neck right there. Again, very soft, it's very subtle. And because we're viewing this character from the opposite side of the strongest light source, we're not seeing any bounce light, right? So we're only interpreting the colors based on the ambient lighting. Now I'm seeing a bit of bluish, purplish colors here at the front side of the face. Let's just take that and glaze it up on the front. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to start a new layer, set it to multiply, okay? And we're going to kind of use the colors that's already here. So using a harder edge brush now, we're just going to brush in some of these kind of ambient occlusion elements just under the jaw, like so. You're also going to see a little bit of a darker shadow just behind the ear. These are just areas that the light is not going to reach. And once you add this, it adds a lot of contrast, you know, which this lighting scenario doesn't have a lot of in the first place. And that's the reason that I wanted to show it, because you don't always get a very high contrast, very obvious kind of light and shadow in the reference that you're looking at. So let's add a bit more kind of multiply layer here just on the front of the forehead. Blend this out, right? And then a little bit more shadow under the eyelid. Just blend that out. And under the nose, a little bit under that bottom lip, and blend these guys out. All right, there we go. And now I'm going to turn this layer off so you can see the difference in contrast here. It's very, very apparent. And compared to the previous example that we did, the rendering in this one is going to be so much more subtle, but we're going to add that final punch, which is, let's start a new layer. Let's pick a very bright color here. This is going to be the rim light. This is the strongest light source in this lighting scenario, but we aren't seeing the surface that's being cast in it. So we're only seeing parts of this light that's peeking through the hair, you know, maybe getting caught a little bit on the skin here. But yeah, you're really not seeing too much of that. Now coming around to the front of the face, you're gonna see a little bit of that just behind the forehead. There's gonna be some rim light just on the nose like that. Very thin, very subtle. Some rim light here under the nose, just like that, okay? And now you've got a much more subtle lighting scenario. Now, if you're wondering how do we do the hair? Well, I'm gonna show you guys that. Okay, we're gonna use the exact same process here. I'm gonna find that light color, okay? Just apply it to the hair like so. You always start with the color blocking, all right? And then you find the shadowy color here, kind of just block that in like so. You know, there's some more shadow here, some more just down here. You're gonna see this area is really dark and the ponytail is pretty dark too. Now you have the light and you have the shadow. You might see a little bit of ambient light here, right? I'm seeing a little bit of blue. So blue, and glaze it right here over this kind of streak of highlight. Chip back into it with the original color, and that looks very good, right? So now let's kind of blend some of these colors out a little bit. I want to add even more saturation here into the darker areas of the hair, just like that. More saturation here at the edge of the ponytail, just like that. Now you can take some of your sharper brushes and lay down some details, and you can use an even darker color to create a little bit more contrast in some of these areas. So right here, for example, up here, you want to add some of these kind of streaky elements in the hair. And without going too far into it, you know, you can kind of see that we follow the same process, right? We figure out the light color, we figure out the dark color. We add in whatever shift in color there is in terms of the ambient light. And if you just simply follow these steps, it makes your light rendering so much simpler. It doesn't have to be something that's super daunting, super intimidating. You know, I'm just adding some textures to the hair here. But yeah, it's honestly quite simple. So there we go. Now I can choose to do some of the skin rendering that we have been not really taking care of here, you know, getting some of that red color in there, warm colors on the cheeks, on the nose, like that. You know, you can really vary it up, but there you go. There's the second scenario. Okay, this is a much more subtle kind of lighting scenario, but if you follow the same steps, you ask yourself why, you analyze the light, no lighting scenario is going to pose a challenge to you. And that's it for today. Hopefully you guys have fun and go out there and try out some lighting scenarios for yourself. I hope this video has helped you guys out. And once again, thank you so much for being here as a part of our Patreon. I put a lot of work into these videos and into teaching you guys, so hopefully it's actually helping you out on your art journey, all right? So that being said, I'll see you guys on the next tutorial.